All right, this particular video is going to be looking at a lot of diagrams that we're sort of paying attention to through some introduction to microeconomics before we get to cost curves. PPF, so if you're asked to do a PPF, it's a production possibility frontier. It is what is possible. All right, so PPF, you're labeling PPF 1. To get to PPF 2, you've got to grow in an economy. That means you increase or improve one of your factors of production. Point A, point B, point C, they're all efficient using all resources. Really depends upon what you want. If you want more of good X, you'd be at A. If you want more of good Y, you'd be at C. If you're at point D, you're not using your resources efficiently. Remember, the PPF helps show us, it helps show us the concept of opportunity cost and scarcity. In order to move from A to B, okay, you can't get more of good Y without giving up some of good X. Now, if you're inefficient, you can get more of both. Remember, if you want to get out to there, you either have to grow as an economy, or if you want to consume past your production possibility frontier, you must trade. Next diagram we're going to look at, it deals with the concept of a downward sloping demand curve. Okay, our law of demand says, holding everything else constant, if you decrease price, you increase quantity demanded. If you increase price, you decrease quantity demanded. Right? Demand curve is downward sloping for three general reasons: diminishing margin of utility, in order to convince you to purchase more of a good; diminishing margin of utility, which means in order to convince you to purchase more of something, price has got to come down because your margin of utility is going down; substitution effect; and income effect. As the price goes down, people substitute away from other products. As the price comes down, you have, in effect, more real income in your pocket. That is a downward sloping demand curve. Remember, if anything else changes, with a determinant for demand besides price, the whole curve shifts. Price is, in a sense, built in to this curve. Right, so if something changes positively, advertising is good. If something is used in a movie that's popular, demand will shift to the right. If something happens negatively, advertising's bad. Something's used in a movie that makes fun of the product, demand shifts to the left. Anything besides price changes causes a shift in demand. Now, just the opposite of what we've talked about, you've got an upward sloping supply curve. Okay, price is built in again. I'll show that on the next one, but in general, the law of supply says that as you increase price, quantity supplied is going to increase. As you decrease price, quantity supplied is going to decrease, and that's holding everything else constant. So again, the law, as you increase price, you're more willing and able to supply a particular product. If anything besides price changes for the supply curve, the whole curve shifts. Right? Price is, in a sense, built in to this particular curve. Again, anywhere along this line, it'd be a movement along the line, movement along the line. If anything else shifts, something that might change factors of production. The weather would be a good example of something. If there's great weather for farming, okay, supply is going to shift to the right. That means it shifts out versus shifts into the left. If the weather was terrible for farming, supply would shift. Those examples had nothing to do with price, and the whole supply curve would change. If anything is going to change, it means that the whole curve will shift, and it is something that is about the factors of production. So we get to what you could call the magic of the market. Market equilibrium is where quantity demanded exactly equals quantity supplied. And we have no incentive to move one way or the other. Where supply and demand meet, that's your price at equilibrium, that's your quantity at equilibrium. If the price was too high, okay, it would send signals to our demand curve. Okay, quantity demanded would be there, send signals to our suppliers, quantity supplied would be there, we'd have a surplus. Okay, we would move along both curves until we reach the point at which quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, with no incentive to move one way or the other. If the price is too low, this particular diagram allows us to put a few things together: supply, demand, elasticity, tax, and then determine, based on elasticities, who bears the most burden of that tax, what we call the most incidence of the tax. In general, when you put both supply and demand on the same diagram, you can determine, even by looking at stuff, which one is more elastic and which one is more inelastic. The curve that is more inelastic bears more of the burden of the price. The way to think of that is by drawing the perfectly inelastic case. The vertical distance shift of the price is just going to go up by the amount of the tax. But if you look at this, demand is clearly more inelastic, okay, than supply. Supply shifts to the left. The vertical distance, okay, the vertical distance between the supply line is the amount of the tax. Tax goes up by, or price goes up by this much. Okay, the vertical distance takes us down there. So supply incidence is there, consumer incidence is there. Okay, the curve that is more inelastic bears the burden. If demand is elastic compared to supply, you notice that price at equilibrium started here. Got a pretty big tax. Price only goes up by a little bit. Right, so this is the incidence borne out by the consumers. This is the incidence of the tax borne out by suppliers. The relative elasticities of the two determine that. The one that is more inelastic, the one that is more vertical, so to speak, is the one that bears the burden overall of the tax. All right, last thing to remind you of, it does not matter whether you shift supply or shift demand in terms of the effects of a tax. Okay, when we shift demand, if it's an excise tax, if for whatever reason hits consumers, okay, this is the new equilibrium price that suppliers receive, but now consumers have to send out to the government the vertical distance of the shift. Okay, they end up paying this much to suppliers here, the amount of the tax to the government, so their price will rise. It's the exact same impact, and then you could compare incidence based on elasticity. You could find deadweight loss, you can change consumer producer surplus, and you can find tax revenue. Thank you for listening, and always remember, for happiness, keep your expectations low and your opportunity cost high.